The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty railway station in Alpine, Texas, and Natalie Edwards stepped down with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a wooden cross clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The September heat of 1878 pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, making her travel-worn dress cling uncomfortably to her skin as she searched the sparse crowd for a face she had seen only once in a faded photograph. Her fingers tightened around the cross that had belonged to her mother, the smooth wood providing comfort in this strange new land so far from Philadelphia. Lucas Tanner stood beside his wagon, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the packed earth. He recognized her immediately from the letter she had sent with her picture, though the photograph had not captured the determination in her green eyes or the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the obvious fear. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing sun-bleached hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent working the harsh Texas land. "Miss Edwards." His voice was deeper than she had imagined, rough from disuse but not unkind. "Mr. Tanner." She shifted the cross to her left hand and extended her right, surprised when he shook it firmly rather than kissing it as the men back east might have done. His palm was calloused and warm, and she felt the strength in his grip. His eyes dropped to the cross in her other hand, and something shifted in his expression. The hardness around his mouth softened, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been relief. "You are a woman of faith." "I am." She held the cross a little higher, meeting his gaze directly. "My mother gave this to me before she passed. I pray every morning and every evening without fail. It is as necessary to me as breathing." Lucas nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Natalie felt a small measure of ease settle into her chest. "Then we pray together always," he said, and the words sounded like a vow. "I have been without someone to share my faith with for too long. This ranch can be a lonely place, and God feels distant when you speak to him only in solitude." She studied him more carefully then, seeing past the rough exterior to the loneliness that lingered in his brown eyes. His letters had been brief and practical, outlining what he could offer her and what he expected in return, but they had mentioned his faith several times. It was the main reason she had chosen to respond to his advertisement rather than the dozens of others she had seen. After losing both her parents to typhoid fever within a month of each other, she had clung to her faith like a lifeline. The thought of sharing her life with a man who understood that need had given her the courage to travel nearly 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. "I would like that very much," she said quietly, "to pray together." He helped her into the wagon, his hands steady and respectful as he lifted her satchel into the back. The town of Alpine was small, barely more than a handful of buildings clustered together in the vast expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert. She could see the Davis Mountains rising in the distance, their peaks touched with the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Everything here was so different from the crowded streets and brick buildings of Philadelphia. The sky seemed impossibly vast, stretching endlessly in every direction, and the air smelled of dust and creosote and something wild she could not name. "The ranch is about an hour from town," Lucas said as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "We will need to stop by the church first if that suits you. Reverend Morris is expecting us. I thought, if you were willing, we might be married this evening." Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she nodded. She had known this would happen quickly. There was no point in a long courtship when she had already traveled so far with the express purpose of becoming his wife. That would be fine. They rode in silence for a few minutes, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically as the horses plodded down the main street. She noticed people stopping to stare, and she felt her cheeks warm under their scrutiny. No doubt the arrival of Lucas Tanner's mail-order bride would be the talk of the town for weeks to come. "I should tell you about the ranch," Lucas said, breaking the silence. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, but she sensed he was choosing his words carefully. "It is not an easy life. The land is hard and the work is constant. I have 2 men who help me, brothers named Samuel and James Porter. They are good men, trustworthy. They live in the bunkhouse on the east side of the property. The house itself is small, just 3 rooms, but it is sturdy. I built it myself 5 years ago when I first claimed the land. Do you run cattle?" She tried to remember what his letters had said, but her mind felt foggy from the long journey. Cattle and horses. "I have about 200 head of cattle and a dozen horses. We drive the cattle to market once a year, and I sell horses to the army when I have them trained well enough. It provides a modest living, enough to support a family if we are careful." He paused, and she saw his jaw tighten. "I want you to know that I will provide for you to the best of my ability. You will never go hungry and you will have a roof over your head, but there will not be luxuries. No fancy dresses or jewelry. Life here is simple. I am not looking for luxuries, Mr. Tanner. I am looking for a home and a partner in faith. My parents were not wealthy people. My father was a clerk and my mother took in sewing. I know how to work hard and make do with little." He glanced at her then, and she saw approval in his eyes. "Please, call me Lucas. If we are to be married, there is no need for such formality." "Then you must call me Natalie." The church was a small wooden structure at the edge of town, painted white but graying from the relentless sun and wind. A simple cross stood atop the steeple, and Natalie felt her spirits lift at the sight of it. Lucas helped her down from the wagon and opened the door, allowing her to step into the cool, dim interior first. Reverend Morris was a portly man with kind eyes and a thick gray beard. He greeted them warmly, shaking Lucas's hand and bowing respectfully to Natalie. "Welcome to Alpine, Miss Edwards. Lucas has spoken of you often since receiving your acceptance of his proposal. It is good to have another faithful soul join our small congregation." "Thank you, Reverend. I am grateful to be here." She clutched her cross tighter, drawing strength from its familiar weight. The ceremony was brief and simple. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond Samuel and James Porter, who had ridden into town to serve as witnesses. Natalie barely heard the words the Reverend spoke. She was too focused on the man standing beside her, on the way his voice did not waver when he repeated his vows, on the calloused warmth of his hand when he slipped a plain gold band onto her finger. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead, and she felt tears prick at her eyes for reasons she could not fully explain. They were married. She was a rancher's wife now, bound to this man and this harsh land for the rest of her life. The ride to the ranch felt longer than an hour. The sun sank lower, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that took her breath away. Lucas pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his voice low and steady. There was the creek that ran through his property, though it was often dry this time of year. There was the grove of cottonwood trees where he had buried his dog 3 years ago. There was the ridge where he sometimes went to think when the loneliness became too much. She listened to every word, committing it all to memory. This was her home now. She needed to learn its contours and secrets. The house came into view just as the last light was fading from the sky. It was indeed small, but it looked solid and well-maintained. A covered porch ran along the front, and she could see curtains hanging in the windows. Beside the house stood a barn and several smaller outbuildings, and beyond that, the bunkhouse where Samuel and James lived. In the distance, she could make out the dark shapes of cattle grazing. Lucas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, then came around to help her. His hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary, and she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. They were married now. Tonight would be their wedding night, but Lucas seemed to sense her apprehension because he released her quickly and picked up her satchel instead. "Let me show you inside. You must be exhausted from your journey." The interior of the house was neat and sparse. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove in one corner and a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs in the center. A pair of rocking chairs sat near the fireplace, and she could see a door leading to what must be the bedroom. The walls were bare except for a single wooden cross that hung above the fireplace, its presence both surprising and comforting. "I know it is not much," Lucas said, watching her survey the room. His voice held a note of uncertainty that she had not heard before. "It is wonderful," she said, and she meant it. The house was clean and orderly, and she could already imagine herself making it into a true home. "Thank you for the cross above the fireplace. It makes me feel welcome. My mother made it. She passed away when I was 16, and it is one of the few things I have to remember her by." He set her satchel down near the bedroom door. "She was a woman of deep faith like you. She would have been happy to know I found someone who shares that." Natalie set her own cross on the mantel beside a kerosene lamp, then turned to face him. "Lucas, I want you to know that I take my vows seriously. I may not know you well yet, but I am committed to being a good wife to you. I will work hard and I will honor the promises I made today." He crossed the room to stand before her, and for the first time, she saw genuine warmth in his expression. "And I will honor mine. I know this is not the romantic beginning you might have dreamed of as a girl, but I promise to be faithful to you and to treat you with respect." "You will never have cause to fear me," she believed him. There was something fundamentally honest about Lucas Tanner, something solid and trustworthy. "Would you like to pray together now?" she asked, "before we do anything else?" His face lit up in a way that transformed him, making him look younger and less careworn. "I would like that very much." They knelt together on the wooden floor, their shoulders almost touching. Natalie bowed her head and clasped her hands around her mother's cross, feeling Lucas do the same beside her. She began to speak, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room, thanking God for her safe journey and for bringing her to this place and this man. She prayed for wisdom and strength, for the ability to be a good wife and partner, for their future together. When she finished, Lucas began his own prayer. His voice was rough with emotion, and she realized with a start that he was nearly overcome. He thanked God for answering his prayers for companionship, for sending him a woman of faith and character. He asked for guidance in being the husband Natalie deserved, for patience and understanding as they learned to live together. He prayed for the ranch and for their future, for children if it was God's will, for many years together in faith and love. When he said amen, they remained kneeling for a moment longer, the silence between them no longer awkward but peaceful. Natalie felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the fear that had gripped her since she first decided to answer his advertisement. This might work. This marriage might actually become something real and good. Lucas stood first and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. "You must be hungry. I am afraid I am not much of a cook, but I have stew on the stove. Samuel's wife made it before she passed last year, and he taught me her recipe." They ate together at the small table, the stew simple but filling. Lucas asked about her journey, and she told him about the train ride across the country, about the changing landscape outside her window, about the other passengers she had met. He listened attentively, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested in her experiences. In turn, she asked about the ranch, about the daily rhythms of life here, about the challenges and rewards of raising cattle and horses in this unforgiving climate. He spoke of droughts and flash floods, of predators that hunted his livestock, of the satisfaction of watching his herd grow year by year through his own hard work. His love for this land was evident in every word, and she found herself beginning to understand what had drawn him to this remote place. When the meal was finished and the dishes washed, an awkward silence fell. It was full dark now, and the kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. Natalie knew what came next, and her heart began to race. Lucas cleared his throat. "I will give you privacy to prepare for bed. I need to check on the horses before I turn in for the night anyway. Take your time." She was grateful for his consideration. Once he had gone outside, she retrieved her nightgown from her satchel and changed quickly, braiding her long, dark hair and washing her face in the basin of water Lucas had left on the dresser. The bedroom was small and contained only a bed, a dresser, and a wardrobe. The bed was larger than she had expected, covered with a patchwork quilt that must have taken months to complete. She climbed under the covers and waited, her mother's cross clutched in her hands. She heard Lucas return, heard him moving around in the main room, heard the sound of water splashing as he washed. Then the door creaked open, and he stepped inside carrying the kerosene lamp. He had removed his shirt, and she could see the muscles of his chest and shoulders, the result of years of hard physical labor. But his eyes were gentle as he looked at her, and he made no move to approach the bed immediately. Instead, he set the lamp on the dresser and sat down in the single chair near the window. "Natalie, I want you to know that I have no expectation of anything tonight. We are strangers still, despite being married. I will not force myself on you. When you are ready, if you ever are, you need only tell me." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by a strange sense of disappointment. She had steeled herself for this moment, had prepared herself to submit to her wifely duties. His unexpected gentleness threw her off balance. "You are my husband now. It is your right. Right or not, I will not take what is not freely given." He met her eyes steadily. "I have waited this long for a wife. I can wait a while longer for us to become comfortable with each other." She did not know what to say to that. The men she had known in Philadelphia had not been given to such consideration of women's feelings. Her father had been a good man but practical, and somewhat distant. Her few suitors before his death had been primarily interested in her modest inheritance, not in her as a person. Lucas's patience was foreign to her, and she found herself wanting to understand him better. "Will you tell me about yourself?" she asked. "Your letters were not very revealing. I know you are 30 years old and that you have been ranching here for 5 years, but little else." He settled back in the chair, seeming relieved to have a safe topic of conversation. "I grew up in Missouri on a small farm. I was the youngest of 4 sons, which meant there would be no land for me to inherit. When I turned 20, I headed west looking for opportunity. I worked on various ranches in Colorado and New Mexico for several years, learning the trade and saving my money. When the opportunity came to claim land here in Texas, I took it. The work was brutal at first, building everything from scratch, but I have never regretted it." "Why did you wait so long to seek a wife?" "I wanted to be established first, to have something real to offer a woman. And truthfully, there are not many unmarried women in these parts. Those who are here are quickly spoken for." I placed the advertisement for a mail-order bride out of desperation more than anything. I was tired of the loneliness, tired of having no one to share my life with. He paused, his expression becoming vulnerable. "And I missed having someone to pray with. The Porters are good men, but they are not believers. Reverend Morris is fine for Sunday services, but it is not the same as having faith woven into the fabric of daily life." "I understand," she said softly. "After my parents died, I went to live with my aunt and uncle. They were kind enough to take me in, but they were not people of faith. They thought my devotion was excessive, even unhealthy. They pressured me constantly to put away my cross and my Bible, to focus on finding a husband from among their social circle. When I saw your advertisement and read about your desire for a wife who shared your faith, it felt like an answer to prayer. Then perhaps we were meant to find each other," Lucas said. "God works in mysterious ways." They talked long into the night, the conversation flowing more easily as the minutes passed. She learned that he loved to read but had few books, that he played the harmonica but only when he was alone because he was self-conscious about his skill, that he had a weakness for dried apples and could eat an entire bag in one sitting if left to his own devices. He learned that she had worked as a seamstress before her parents' illness, that she had a beautiful singing voice, but had stopped singing after her mother died, that she was terrified of snakes but fascinated by the stars. Finally, when exhaustion made her eyelids heavy, Lucas stood and moved toward the door. "Sleep well, Natalie. I will be just outside if you need anything." "You are going to sleep in a chair." She sat up, alarmed. "Lucas, that is ridiculous. This is your bed. I cannot take it from you." "You are not taking anything. I am giving it freely. The bed is large enough for both of us. We can maintain a respectful distance." She felt her cheeks warm but pushed forward. "I will not have you uncomfortable in your own home because of me. Please, stay." He hesitated, clearly torn, but finally nodded. "If you are certain." "I am." He extinguished the lamp and climbed into the other side of the bed, staying as far from her as the mattress allowed. She could hear his breathing in the darkness, could feel the warmth of his body despite the space between them. It was strange and intimate and not entirely unpleasant. "Good night, Natalie," he whispered. "Good night, Lucas." She fell asleep clutching her cross, feeling safer than she had in months. The next morning, Natalie woke to find Lucas already gone, the space beside her cold. Sunlight streamed through the window, and she could hear the sounds of activity outside. She rose quickly and dressed, then braided her hair and went to investigate. The main room was empty, but she could see Lucas through the window, working near the barn with Samuel and James. She took the opportunity to explore the kitchen more thoroughly, taking inventory of what supplies were available. There was flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, a small amount of sugar, and some strips of dried beef. It was not much, but she could work with it. She had just started a pot of coffee when the door opened and Lucas stepped inside. His shirt was already dusty and there was a smudge of dirt on his cheek, but his eyes brightened when he saw her. "I did not mean to wake you so early. I tried to be quiet." "You did not wake me." "I am accustomed to rising early." She gestured to the coffee pot. "I thought you might like some breakfast. I am afraid it will be simple. I have not had time to assess what we have or make a proper meal plan. Anything you make will be better than what I usually manage." He washed his hands in the basin and sat down at the table. "Samuel and James will be joining us. I hope that is acceptable. We usually eat breakfast together before starting the day's work." "Of course." The two brothers arrived a few minutes later, removing their hats respectfully when they entered. Samuel was the older of the two, perhaps 40 years old, with gray streaking his dark hair. James was younger, maybe 35, with laugh lines around his eyes. Both men were lean and weathered, their faces burned dark by the sun. "Mrs. Tanner," Samuel said, nodding to her. "It is a pleasure to meet you properly. Welcome to the ranch." "Thank you, Samuel. Please call me Natalie." She served them coffee and cornbread that she made quickly while they waited, apologizing for the meager offering. But the men ate as though it was a feast, complimenting her cooking until she felt embarrassed by their praise. As they ate, Lucas outlined the work for the day. There were fences that needed mending on the north pasture, several horses that needed breaking, and one of the cows was showing signs of illness and needed to be separated from the herd. It was clear that the work never ended, that there was always something demanding attention. "What would you like me to do?" Natalie asked when the men had finished eating and were preparing to leave. Lucas looked surprised. "Whatever you would like. The house is yours to manage as you see fit." "I mean what work needs doing. I did not come here to be idle." "There is a vegetable garden behind the house that has been neglected since I have no skill with growing things. If you could tend to it, that would be helpful. And there is mending that needs doing. I have a pile of shirts and trousers with holes worn through them. Beyond that, truly, manage the house as you wish. I trust your judgment." After the men left, Natalie set about exploring her new domain more thoroughly. The vegetable garden was indeed in poor condition, choked with weeds and clearly not watered enough. But she could see the bones of something good beneath the neglect. There were tomato plants struggling to survive, a few pepper plants, some wilted lettuce. She spent the morning pulling weeds and carrying bucket after bucket of water from the creek. It was hot, back-breaking work, so different from the sewing she had done in Philadelphia. But there was something satisfying about it too, about sinking her hands into the dirt and coaxing life from the stubborn earth. She found herself humming as she worked, and then, tentatively, singing softly. The songs were hymns, the ones her mother had loved best, and tears pricked her eyes as the familiar melodies filled the air. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear Lucas approach until he spoke. "You have a beautiful voice." She jumped, nearly dropping the bucket she was holding. "I did not hear you. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. I just came to check on you and to bring you some water. You have been working for hours." He held out a canteen, his expression concerned. "You should rest. It is too hot to be laboring like this in the middle of the day." She took the canteen gratefully and drank deeply. The water was cool and sweet, and she had not realized how thirsty she was. "Thank you. I got carried away. The garden was in such poor shape, and I wanted to save what I could." He looked past her at the transformed space, and she saw approval in his eyes. "You have accomplished more in one morning than I did in months of half-hearted attempts. I am grateful. But truly, you should come inside and rest during the hottest part of the day. You can work again in the evening when it is cooler." She allowed him to lead her back to the house, and he insisted she sit while he prepared a simple lunch of bread and cheese. They ate together, and she found herself studying him in the daylight, noting details she had missed the night before. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow, and his hands, though rough, were surprisingly graceful. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I was just thinking that I am glad I came here," she said honestly. "I was terrified during the entire journey, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake, but this feels right." His face softened. "I am glad, too. I know we have much to learn about each other still, but I have a good feeling about this, about us." That evening, after another simple dinner, they prayed together again. It was becoming a comfortable ritual already, this kneeling side by side and speaking to God together. Natalie felt her anxiety about her new life fading a little more with each prayer, replaced by a cautious hope. The days began to fall into a pattern. Natalie woke early and prepared breakfast for Lucas and the Porter brothers. After the men left to work, she tended to the house and the garden, did the mending, and began to explore the possibilities of the ranch. She found wild herbs growing near the creek and started collecting them to use in cooking. She discovered that there were chickens in one of the outbuildings that had been largely left to their own devices, and she began caring for them properly, rewarded with fresh eggs each morning. In the evenings, after the work was done and dinner was eaten, she and Lucas would sit on the porch and talk. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, plans for the ranch and the house. Other times they shared stories from their pasts, slowly revealing themselves to each other. And always, before they went to bed, they prayed together. At night, they lay side by side in the bed, maintaining a respectful distance but growing more comfortable with each other's presence. Sometimes Lucas would reach out in his sleep, and his hand would brush against hers, and she found she did not mind. Sometimes she would wake to find herself curled toward him, drawn by his warmth, and he would be watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as tenderness. 3 weeks after her arrival, Natalie woke to find Lucas already up and dressed, sitting in the chair by the window. It was still dark outside, not yet time for the usual morning routine, and she sat up in concern. "Lucas, what is wrong?" He turned to look at her, and even in the dim light, she could see the emotion on his face. "Nothing is wrong. I was just watching you sleep and thinking about how much my life has changed in such a short time. Natalie, I want you to know that you have brought me more happiness in these few weeks than I have known in years. This house feels like a home now, not just a place I sleep. And I find myself looking forward to the evenings, to our conversations and our prayers together, more than anything else in my day." Her heart began to beat faster. "I feel the same way. When I first arrived, I thought this was just an arrangement, a practical solution to both our problems. But it has become so much more than that." He rose from the chair and came to sit on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. "I do not want to rush you or make you uncomfortable, but I need to tell you that my feelings for you have grown beyond respect and friendship. I am falling in love with you, Natalie." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Natalie's breath caught in her throat. She had been feeling the same way but had been afraid to name it, afraid that it was too soon or that she was fooling herself. But hearing Lucas say it out loud gave her the courage to be honest. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face in his calloused hand. "May I kiss you?" "Yes." His lips met hers gently, tentatively, a question more than a demand. She responded instinctively, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders. The kiss deepened, becoming less tentative and more assured, and she felt heat bloom in her belly. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. "I want this marriage to be real in every way," Lucas said, his voice rough. "Not just in name but in truth." "But only if you want that too." "I do," she said, and she meant it. The fear that had gripped her on her wedding night was gone, replaced by a different kind of nervousness, one tinged with anticipation and desire. "I want that very much." He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation on either side. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and she went willingly. They moved together awkwardly at first, still learning each other's bodies and rhythms, but what they lacked in experience, they made up for in tenderness and patience. Lucas was gentle with her, constantly asking if she was all right, if he was hurting her, and she felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head resting on his chest and his arms wrapped around her. She could hear his heartbeat beneath her ear, steady and strong, and she felt a peace settle over her that went soul deep. "Thank you," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair, "for taking a chance on me on this life, for making this house a home. Thank you for being patient with me, for giving me time to feel safe with you. I think God knew what he was doing when he brought us together." "I think so too." They fell asleep that way, wrapped around each other, and when Natalie woke a few hours later to the first light of dawn, she felt fundamentally changed. She was not just Lucas's wife in name now. She was his wife in truth, his partner in every sense of the word. The seasons changed, and with them, the rhythms of the ranch. Natalie threw herself into making the house and land truly theirs. She pickled and preserved the vegetables from the garden, ensuring they would have food through the winter. She sewed new curtains for the windows and a new quilt for their bed, working by lamplight in the evenings while Lucas read to her from his small collection of books. She learned to milk the cow that Lucas bought from a neighboring ranch and to make butter and cheese. Lucas, in turn, taught her to ride, patiently guiding her through the basics until she could manage a gentle mare on her own. He showed her the boundaries of their land, pointing out the best grazing areas and the places where water could always be found. He involved her in decisions about the ranch, asking her opinion on which horses to sell and when to take the cattle to market. They continued to pray together every morning and evening without fail, and their faith became the foundation on which their love was built. On Sundays, they rode into Alpine for church services, and Natalie slowly began to make friends among the small congregation. The other ranch wives welcomed her, sharing advice about surviving the harsh Texas climate and inviting her to quilting bees and prayer meetings. As winter approached, Natalie realized that her monthly courses had not come. At first, she thought it was just the stress of adjusting to her new life, but when another month passed with no sign of them, she began to suspect the truth. She said nothing to Lucas yet, wanting to be certain before she got his hopes up, but she found herself praying fervently each night, asking God to confirm what she suspected. When the third month passed, and she began to feel queasy in the mornings, she knew. She was carrying Lucas's child. She chose to tell him on a Sunday evening after they had returned from church. They had prayed together as usual, and now they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and took a deep breath. "Lucas, I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her as though he could not quite process her words. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "As certain as I can be. I have missed my courses for 3 months now, and I have been sick in the mornings. I wanted to wait to tell you until I was sure." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, and she saw tears shining in his eyes. "This is the greatest blessing. I cannot believe it. We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" "Happy, Natalie, I am beyond happy. I am overwhelmed with joy." He placed a hand on her still flat stomach, his touch reverent. Thank you for this gift." They held each other as the last light faded from the sky, both of them crying and laughing in equal measure. That night, Lucas prayed with more fervor than she had ever heard, thanking God for the miracle of new life and asking for protection over Natalie and the baby. She felt his love surrounding her like a blanket, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice in coming to Alpine. The pregnancy was not easy. The morning sickness lasted well into her 4th month, leaving her weak and exhausted. The summer heat made her uncomfortable and swollen. But Lucas was attentive to her every need, insisting she rest during the hottest parts of the day and taking over many of her usual chores. Samuel and James were equally solicitous, treating her like precious porcelain that might break at any moment. As her belly grew round with their child, Natalie found herself falling even more deeply in love with her husband. She loved the way he spoke to the baby through her stomach each night, telling stories and singing softly. She loved the way he looked at her, as though she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, despite her ungainly size and constant discomfort. She loved the way his hand would come to rest on her belly without conscious thought, as though drawn there by instinct. In February of 1879, during a rare snowfall that blanketed the desert in white, Natalie went into labor. Lucas rode for the doctor in Alpine, pushing his horse to dangerous speeds over the slick roads. The next hours were a blur of pain and fear and determination. The doctor arrived just in time, and with Lucas holding her hand and praying constantly, Natalie brought their son into the world. They named him Matthew, after Lucas's father, and he was perfect. He had Lucas's brown eyes and Natalie's dark hair, and when he wrapped his tiny hand around her finger for the first time, she felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. Lucas wept openly when he held his son for the first time, cradling the tiny bundle against his chest with infinite tenderness. "Thank you," he whispered to Natalie. "Thank you for him. Thank you for everything." The months after Matthew's birth were exhausting but filled with joy. Natalie had never known she could function on so little sleep, or that she could love something so fiercely. Lucas was a devoted father, walking the floor with Matthew during the long nights so Natalie could rest, changing diapers without complaint, and simply staring at his son in wonder during quiet moments. They had Matthew baptized in the little church in Alpine, with Reverend Morris performing the ceremony and half the town in attendance. As the water touched their son's forehead and the Reverend spoke the sacred words, Natalie felt the rightness of it all settle into her bones. This was her family. This was her home. This was the life God had intended for her all along. As Matthew grew from an infant into a toddler, the ranch prospered. Lucas's careful management and hard work were paying off. The herd grew larger and healthier each year. The horse-breaking operation expanded as Lucas's reputation for producing well-trained mounts spread. They were able to add on to the house, building a separate bedroom for Matthew and a proper parlor where they could entertain the friends they had made in the community. Natalie continued to tend the garden, which flourished under her care. She began selling her excess produce in town, using the money to buy small luxuries like books and fabric for new clothes. She joined the church women's auxiliary and became known for her beautiful singing voice, often performing solos during Sunday services. She never forgot the loneliness and fear she had felt when she first stepped off that stagecoach, and she made it her mission to welcome newcomers to Alpine, offering friendship and support to anyone who needed it. When Matthew was 2 years old, Natalie found herself pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect or perhaps because her body had adapted to the harsh climate. Lucas was, if anything, even more protective than he had been the first time, but he tried to temper his worry with trust in Natalie's strength and capability. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1881, a sunny day when the desert was covered in wildflowers. They named her Rose, after Natalie's mother, and she was her father's heart from the moment she drew her first breath. She had Natalie's green eyes and Lucas's stubborn chin, and she filled their home with her lusty cries and later, her infectious laughter. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple pleasures. Matthew grew tall and strong, following his father everywhere and learning the ways of the ranch. Rose was sunshine personified, bringing joy to everyone she encountered. Lucas's hair began to show threads of silver at the temples, and lines of laughter and sun etched themselves deeper into his face. Natalie's hands grew calloused from work, but her heart grew softer with each passing year. They never stopped praying together, morning and evening without fail. It was the bedrock of their marriage and their family. When times were hard, when drought threatened the herd or illness struck, they knelt together and found strength in their shared faith. When times were good, when the rains came and the cattle were fat and their children were healthy, they knelt together and gave thanks. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Natalie by taking her into town for a rare dinner at the hotel restaurant. They left the children with Samuel, who had become like an uncle to them and dressed in their best clothes. Over steak and potatoes, Lucas reached across the table and took her hand. "You remember the day you arrived?" he asked. "How terrified you looked, clutching that cross like it was the only solid thing in the world." "I remember," she said, laughing. "I thought I was going to faint from fear. You were this tall, stern stranger, and I had no idea if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. When I saw that cross in your hand, I felt hope for the first time in years. I knew that if you carried your faith so openly, so boldly, then maybe we had a chance. And when I said we would pray together always, I meant it. That promise has been the foundation of everything good in my life." "Mine too," she said softly. "I came here looking for a home and a partner, and I found so much more than that. I found love and purpose and a family. I found you. I would not change a single thing, not even the hard times, because they all led us here." "To think I almost did not place that advertisement," Lucas said. "I thought it was foolish, desperate, but it was the best decision I ever made. And I almost did not respond. My aunt thought I was being ridiculous, throwing my life away on a man I had never met. But something in your letter called to me. Your honesty, your faith, your loneliness that echoed my own. I think God was speaking through that letter, telling me this was where I needed to be." They finished their meal and walked through the quiet streets of Alpine, hand in hand, enjoying the rare opportunity to be alone together. The town had grown over the years, new buildings and new families arriving as the railroad brought more people west. But the little white church remained unchanged, still standing as a beacon of faith in the vast desert. They stopped in front of it, and Lucas pulled Natalie close, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I love you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I have loved you almost from the beginning, but that love has grown and deepened with every year we have been together. You are my partner, my best friend, the mother of my children, and the keeper of my heart. I thank God for you every single day." "I love you too," she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me faith when mine was shaking. You gave me love when I thought I would spend my life alone. You are everything to me, Lucas Tanner." He kissed her there in the moonlight, in front of the church where they had married a decade ago, and it felt like a renewal of their vows. They had promised to love each other for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death parted them. They had kept those promises through 10 years of challenges and triumphs, and they would keep them for however many years God granted them together. As they rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, Natalie thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived. That frightened girl clutching her cross seemed like a stranger now. She had been so uncertain, so afraid of the unknown. But she had found her courage and her strength in this harsh land, and she had built a life worth living. When they arrived home, they paid Samuel and checked on the children, both sleeping peacefully in their beds. Then they went to their own room, and before they prepared for sleep, they knelt together as they had done every night for 10 years. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing Natalie to me," Lucas prayed, his voice quiet in the darkness. "Thank you for our children, for our home, for the life we have built together. Thank you for the blessing of a wife who shares my faith and walks beside me in love. Guide us in the years ahead and help us to always honor you in our marriage and our family. Thank you, Lord, for this life you have given me," Natalie prayed. "For a husband who loves you and loves me, for children who bring such joy, for a home and a purpose. Thank you for answering the prayers of a frightened girl who stepped off a stagecoach clutching a cross, not knowing what awaited her but trusting in your plan. Help me to be the wife and mother you have called me to be, and to always keep faith at the center of my life. They climbed into bed and held each other close, the familiar comfort of their embrace never growing old. Outside, the desert night was quiet except for the sound of the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside, their home was filled with peace. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Matthew turned out to have his father's skill with horses and his mother's tender heart. By the time he was 16, he was managing much of the horse operation himself, breaking and training mounts that were sought after throughout West Texas. Rose inherited her mother's beautiful voice and her father's determination. She sang in the church choir and helped Natalie with the younger children who came along, because there were more children. 2 years after Rose came James, named for one of the Porter brothers, and 2 years after him came Grace. The house expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and the noise and chaos of 4 children filled every corner. But Lucas and Natalie navigated it all with patience and humor, leaning on each other and on their faith. Samuel Porter remained with them until he passed away peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 68. James stayed on for another year before deciding to move to California to live with his daughter. By then, Matthew was old enough to take over most of the responsibilities, and Lucas hired a young man from town to help with the daily work. The ranch itself became one of the most successful in the region. Lucas's careful stewardship and Natalie's wise management of their finances allowed them not just to survive but to thrive. They were never wealthy by any standard, but they had enough. More than enough. They had a comfortable home, healthy children, good friends, and a community that respected them. Through it all, through every joy and every sorrow, every triumph and every setback, Lucas and Natalie prayed together. Morning and evening without fail, they knelt side by side and spoke to God. It was as natural as breathing, as essential as food and water. Their children grew up seeing this devotion and absorbing it, learning that faith was not just something you practiced on Sundays but something that shaped every moment of your life. When Natalie turned 40, she found herself pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. She had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but God apparently had other plans. The pregnancy was difficult, her body not as resilient as it had been in her youth, and Lucas worried constantly. But their 5th child, a boy they named Samuel after their dear friend, was born healthy and strong. Matthew married at 20 to a sweet girl from Alpine named Sarah, and they built a house on the far corner of the ranch property. Within a year, they presented Lucas and Natalie with their first grandchild, a little girl with red hair and a temper to match. The joy of becoming grandparents was something neither of them had anticipated, and Lucas proved to be as devoted to his granddaughter as he was to his own children. Rose met a young teacher who came to Alpine to run the new schoolhouse, and after a courtship that lasted 2 years, she married him in the same church where her parents had wed. They moved into town, and Rose threw herself into supporting her husband's work, while also becoming active in various charitable causes. James showed an aptitude for numbers and business that surprised everyone. He helped his father and brother manage the financial side of the ranch, modernizing their record-keeping and finding new markets for their cattle and horses. Grace, the baby before Samuel came along, was still finding her way, but she showed signs of inheriting both her mother's nurturing nature and her father's strong will. Young Samuel grew up in a house filled with love and laughter, doted on by his older siblings and parents alike. He was a happy child, always singing or laughing, and he brought light into their lives during what might have been their quieter years. The town of Alpine continued to grow around them. The railroad brought more commerce and more people. Schools and shops multiplied. The rough frontier town of Natalie's arrival transformed into a real community with churches and civic organizations and social events. But the little white church remained at the heart of it all, and Lucas and Natalie remained faithful members, their presence a constant through decades of change. When they had been married for 25 years, their children organized a surprise celebration. The entire community turned out, filling the church to capacity. Reverend Morris, now elderly but still serving his congregation faithfully, gave a sermon about the power of faith-filled marriage and held up Lucas and Natalie as an example of what love rooted in God could accomplish. People stood and shared stories about how the Tanners had impacted their lives. Women spoke of Natalie's kindness and generosity, how she had welcomed them when they were new to town or brought food when they were sick. Men talked about Lucas's integrity and fairness in business dealings, how his word was as good as any contract. Their children spoke tearfully about the example their parents had set, about the legacy of faith and love they were passing down to the next generation. Through it all, Lucas and Natalie sat hand in hand, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection. When it was time for them to speak, Lucas stood and helped Natalie to her feet. They faced the crowded church together, as they had faced everything for 25 years. "Thank you all for being here," Lucas began, his voice strong despite his 65 years. "Natalie and I are humbled by your kindness and your words, but we want you to know that whatever good we have done, whatever positive influence we might have had, it all comes from God. We are just ordinary people who chose to put our faith first and let it guide our lives and our marriage." Natalie nodded, then added, "When I arrived in Alpine 25 years ago, I was terrified and alone, clutching my mother's cross and praying for courage. Lucas promised me that we would pray together always, and he has kept that promise every single day of our marriage. That commitment to shared faith is what has carried us through every challenge and magnified every joy. We want our legacy to be this: that faith matters, that prayer matters, that choosing to honor God in your daily life matters. Everything else flows from that." There was not a dry eye in the church as they sat back down. The celebration continued with food and music and dancing, and Lucas and Natalie were surrounded by love. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, they stood on the church steps and watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. "Can you believe it has been 25 years?" Natalie asked, leaning into Lucas's side. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together," he replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I cannot imagine my life without you. You are as much a part of me as my own heartbeat." "I feel the same way. You are my home, Lucas. Not this place, not even the ranch we have built together, but you. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." They stood there until full dark fell, then walked slowly to their wagon for the ride back to the ranch. Their oldest son, Matthew, and his family had already gone ahead to take care of the evening chores. Their other children were spending the night in town with friends. For the first time in years, Lucas and Natalie had the house to themselves. They prepared for bed in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of long familiarity. Then, as they had done every night for 25 years, they knelt beside their bed and prayed together. Tonight's prayers were filled with gratitude for the years they had been given, for the family they had raised, for the community that had embraced them, for the countless blessings, large and small, that had filled their lives. When they climbed into bed, Lucas pulled Natalie close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. They were older now, their bodies marked by years of hard work and the passage of time, but the love between them had only grown stronger and deeper. "I would do it all again," Natalie whispered into the darkness. "Every moment, every hardship, every joy, I would choose you and this life again and again." "As would I," Lucas said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You are the greatest blessing God has ever given me." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together. The years after their 25th anniversary were good ones. The ranch continued to prosper under Matthew's management, allowing Lucas to step back from the daily operations and spend more time with his growing family of grandchildren. He taught them to ride and rope, passing down the skills and knowledge he had accumulated over a lifetime. Natalie had more time for her garden and her community work, and she became known as the matriarch of Alpine, the woman people turned to for advice and comfort. They traveled occasionally, something they had never had time or money for when they were younger. They took a trip to San Antonio to see the Alamo and another to Dallas to visit a cousin of Lucas's, but they never stayed away from the ranch for long. It was their home, the place where their roots ran deep, and they were always eager to return. As they moved into their 60s, health problems began to surface. Lucas developed arthritis in his hands, making certain tasks difficult. Natalie's eyesight began to fail, forcing her to give up the detailed sewing work she had once loved. But they adapted, finding ways to work around their limitations and refusing to let age slow them down too much. Through it all, they continued to pray together morning and evening without fail. If one of them was sick, the other would sit beside the bed and they would pray there. If they were traveling, they would find a quiet moment to kneel wherever they were staying. The promise Lucas had made on their wedding day had been kept faithfully for over 30 years, and neither of them could imagine breaking that pattern now. When Natalie was 65, she suffered a stroke that left her weakened on her left side. Lucas was terrified he would lose her, but she fought her way back with characteristic determination. The recovery was long and frustrating, but Lucas never left her side, helping her through the exercises the doctor prescribed and encouraging her when she wanted to give up. Slowly, painfully, she regained most of her strength and mobility, though she would always walk with a slight limp and tire more easily than before. The stroke made them both acutely aware of their mortality. They began to put their affairs in order, making sure their will was updated and that their children understood their wishes. They wrote letters to each of their grandchildren, sharing their faith stories and the lessons they had learned over a lifetime. They wanted to leave a legacy not just of land and property, but of faith and love. On their 40th anniversary, they celebrated quietly at home with just their immediate family. It was a cold winter evening, snow falling softly outside the windows, and the house was filled with the warmth of the fire and the love of their children and grandchildren. They were surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, wedding pictures grown faded with age, quilts Natalie had stitched during long winter evenings, furniture Lucas had built with his own hands, grandchildren playing on the floor. After dinner, Lucas stood and raised his glass. 40 years ago today, I married the bravest woman I have ever known. She traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger because she believed God was calling her to do so. She built a home in the wilderness and raised our children with love and wisdom and faith. She has been my partner in every sense of the word, my best friend, my greatest blessing. Natalie, I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Natalie was crying openly, as were most of their daughters and daughters-in-law. "Lucas, you gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home, a family, a purpose. But most of all, you gave me a partnership rooted in faith that has sustained me through every trial and magnified every joy. You kept your promise to pray with me always, and that faithfulness has been the foundation of our love. I am so grateful God brought me to you." Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, embracing them and adding their own words of love and appreciation. It was a moment of pure joy, the kind that comes from a life well lived and love well shared. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Lucas and Natalie knelt together one last time for the day. Their bodies were old and creaky, and getting down on their knees was harder than it used to be, but they managed. They prayed together, thanking God for 40 years of marriage, for children and grandchildren, for the countless blessings that had filled their lives. They prayed for the years ahead, however many they might be given, and for the strength to face whatever challenges came with grace and faith. When they finally climbed into bed, they held each other close. These two people who had started as strangers and become one flesh, one heart, one spirit through the power of love and faith. Lucas passed away 3 years later at the age of 73. It was sudden, a heart attack while he was working in the barn. Matthew found him and carried him into the house, but he was already gone. Natalie held him as the life left his body, whispering prayers and words of love, telling him it was all right to go, that she would be fine, that she would see him again. The grief was overwhelming. They had been together for 43 years, and the thought of life without him seemed impossible. The whole community turned out for the funeral, and the church was so packed that people had to stand outside. Reverend Morris, now quite elderly but still presiding over the church, spoke of Lucas's faith and integrity, of the life he had built and the legacy he was leaving behind. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, in sight of the house he had built and the land he had loved. Natalie stood beside the grave with her children surrounding her, and she felt as though half of her soul had been buried with him. The days after the funeral were the hardest. She would wake in the morning and reach for him, only to find empty space beside her. She would start to call out to tell him something, then remember he was not there to hear it. Everything reminded her of him: his favorite chair, his coffee cup, his work boots by the door. But she endured because she had faith that this separation was only temporary. She believed with her whole heart that Lucas was with God now, at peace and free from pain. And she believed that when her time came, they would be reunited. That faith sustained her through the darkest days of her grief. She continued to pray morning and evening, though it was harder now to kneel alone. Sometimes one of her children or grandchildren would join her, but it was not the same. She missed Lucas's voice joining with hers, missed the familiar rhythm of their shared prayers. Matthew and his family urged her to come live with them, but she refused. The house she and Lucas had built was her home, filled with memories of their life together. She was not ready to leave it, so she stayed, with her youngest son Samuel and his new wife nearby to check on her regularly. She filled her days with the work of living. She tended her garden, though it was harder now without Lucas to help with the heavy digging. She visited with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing down family stories and recipes. She continued her work with the church, teaching Sunday school to the youngest children and organizing prayer meetings for the women. But at night, she was alone. And in those quiet hours, she would hold the wooden cross that had belonged to her mother, the same cross she had been clutching when she first arrived in Alpine all those years ago. She would remember the promise Lucas had made that first day. "Then we pray together always." He had kept that promise faithfully for 43 years, and even though he was gone, she felt his presence when she prayed. 2 years after Lucas's death, Natalie's health began to decline. Her heart was weakening, and she grew tired easily. The doctor said there was nothing to be done, that she had simply lived a long, full life and her body was wearing out. She accepted this with calm grace, feeling almost relieved. She had lived 82 years, and she was ready to go home. On a spring morning when the desert was covered in wildflowers and the sky was impossibly blue, Natalie woke feeling peaceful. She knew somehow that this was her last day. She asked Samuel to gather the family, and by afternoon they were all there. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filling the house with life and love. She spoke to each of them individually, sharing final words of wisdom and affection. She gave away her treasured possessions, including her mother's cross, which she gave to her oldest granddaughter. She wanted them to remember her and to remember the faith that had guided her life. As evening approached, she asked them all to join her in prayer one last time. They gathered around her bed, holding hands, and she led them in thanking God for the life she had been given. She thanked him for bringing her to Lucas, for their 43 years together, for the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren surrounding her now. She prayed for their futures, asking God to guide and protect them. And she asked God to welcome her home and to let her see Lucas again. When the prayer ended, she lay back on her pillows, exhausted but content. Her children and grandchildren took turns sitting with her through the night, holding her hand and telling her they loved her. As dawn broke on a new day, Natalie took her last breath with a smile on her face, as though she could see something beautiful that the rest of them could not yet see. They buried her beside Lucas on the hill overlooking the ranch. The whole community came to say goodbye to the woman who had been a pillar of faith and love for over 50 years. They spoke of her kindness and her strength, of the legacy she was leaving behind, of the way her faith had impacted everyone who knew her. Matthew stood before the gathered crowd and shared the story of his parents' marriage, of how his mother had arrived holding a cross, and his father had promised they would pray together always. "They kept that promise until death parted them," he said, his voice breaking. But even death could not break the bond they forged through faith and love. They built not just a ranch but a family, not just a house but a home, not just a life but a legacy. And that legacy lives on in all of us. The cross that had belonged to Natalie's mother, the one she had clutched when she first arrived in Alpine, was passed down through the generations. It became a family treasure, a symbol of faith and courage and the power of love rooted in God. Each generation heard the story of how a frightened young woman had stepped off a stagecoach in 1878, holding nothing but a cross and her faith, and how a lonely rancher had promised that they would pray together always. The ranch itself remained in the Tanner family for generations. Matthew's children and grandchildren continued to work the land, building on the foundation Lucas and Natalie had laid. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original 3 rooms remained at its heart, preserved as a reminder of where it all began. The little white church in Alpine still stands today, though it has been joined by many others as the town continued to grow. But old-timers still tell the story of Lucas and Natalie Tanner, of their faith-filled marriage and the legacy they left behind. Young couples getting married at the church are told about them as an example of what marriage can be when faith is at its center. On the hill, overlooking what is now a thriving modern ranch, 2 headstones stand side by side. One reads, Lucas Tanner, 1848–1921, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, a man of faith. The other reads, Natalie Tanner, 1856–1938, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, a woman of courage and faith. Between them, carved into a single stone, are the words, Then we pray together always. Their story became legend in Alpine, a testament to the power of faith and love, to the courage of a woman who traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, and to the faithfulness of a man who kept his promise every single day for 43 years. It is a reminder that the greatest adventures sometimes begin with a simple act of faith, with stepping into the unknown, clutching only your beliefs and your courage. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blows across the Texas desert and the sun sets over the Davis Mountains, some say you can almost hear the echo of two voices raised in prayer, still joined together in faith and love, still keeping the promise that bound them in life and follows them into eternity. The mail-order bride arrived holding a cross. The rancher said, Then we pray together always. And from that promise grew a love story that transcended time, a marriage that exemplified faith, and a legacy that continues to inspire generations. It is a story of the Wild West, of hard work and harsh conditions, of cowboys and cattle and wide open spaces. But more than that, it is a story of two souls who found each other across the miles and built something beautiful together, rooted in the faith they shared and the love they chose every single day. Their descendants still gather each year on what would have been Lucas and Natalie's wedding anniversary. They stand on that hill beside the graves and share stories passed down through the generations. They talk about the woman who stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a cross and her courage. They remember the man who promised they would pray together always and never broke that vow. And then they join hands, all of them together, and they pray, keeping alive the tradition that began so many years ago. The youngest children ask if the stories are really true, if their great-great-great-grandparents really loved each other that much, if faith really can be that powerful. And the older ones smile and say, yes, it is all true. They have the letters to prove it, preserved carefully through the years. They have the cross that Natalie carried, now in a place of honor in the family home. They have the evidence of the life Lucas and Natalie built together, the ranch that still thrives, the family that has grown and spread across the country, but always returns to Alpine to remember their roots. But more than any physical evidence, they have the legacy itself, the example of a marriage built on faith and sustained by love. They have the knowledge that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they put God first. They have the reminder that promises matter, that faithfulness matters, that choosing love every single day through all the challenges life brings can create something that lasts beyond one lifetime. And so the story endures, told and retold, inspiring new generations to hold fast to their faith, to honor their promises, to choose love even when it is difficult. The mail-order bride who arrived holding a cross, and the rancher who promised they would pray together, always live on not just in memory, but in the lives they touched, and the legacy they created. In the end, that is all any of us can hope for, to love well, to live faithfully, to leave behind something that matters. Lucas and Natalie Tanner did all of that and more. They took a chance on each other, on a life in the Wild West, on a future they could not see but trusted God to guide. And they built something beautiful that continues to shine as a beacon of hope and faith, reminding us all that the greatest adventures begin not with certainty but with courage, not with knowledge but with faith, not with perfection but with the commitment to keep showing up and choosing love, day after day, year after year, until death and beyond.